God's purpose is tied to his name. And the purpose of Yahweh has never changed. Throughout the history of man's existence, God has desired to be with his people, God with us. And that's what his name is all about. God's name literally means, I am that I am, or I will be who I will become. And essentially it refers to God's plan and purpose with the earth, to have a relationship with his people, to dwell with them in a future perfect world. Our weekend is a time of appreciating God's presence in our lives, a God who is active and in our lives today. Not just a God who is written about in a book, but a God who is. Let's look at Revelation 1 verse 8 from one of the quotes that the committee developed our theme from. It says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. God captures the essence of his name and his purpose and his person. He is a God who is present with us, present with his people. And this idea is powerfully driven home in Paul's letter to the Hebrews. It's a chapter I'm sure you're familiar with, Hebrews 11 and verse 6. It says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe, one, that he exists, and two, that he rewards those who seek him. If we want to draw near to God, if we want to experience his presence in our lives, if we want a relationship with him, Paul says we must first believe that he exists. And that's the first half of God's name. I am, a God who is, as Revelation said. But we must also believe that he rewards those who seek him. And that's the second part of God's powerful name, who I will become. God's presence in your life, it isn't just an abstract concept. It's directly linked to his name and character. It's intrinsic to his connection with his people. Aidan Tozer, a biblical scholar, put it this way: we need never shout across the spaces to an absent God. He is nearer than our own soul, closer than our most secret thoughts. Robert Roberts, in an article about the presence of God in our lives, said this: there is nothing in our life which we can put our finger on and say, this is divine, as contrasted with something that is human. We have no burning bush, no dry fleece, no angelic visit. Without instruction, we might therefore suppose that there is no God in our life, no guidance to our steps. But in this we should make a great and demoralising mistake. Our inability to detect his participation is no proof that his hand is not there. It is only in certain cases where his guidance takes part. It all depends upon whether they stand related to his purpose. And the concluding words are on the screen. The point lies here that our circumstances being natural does not mean that they are not also divine. And that's what our weekend together is all about. The power of the present, God's active participation in our lives. And it's a powerful theme for us to gather around. And it's my prayer that you walk away from this weekend comforted and encouraged, and that you have your heart set on fire because you understand that whatever you're going through, you have the creator of the universe present in your life. That's the power of the present. Our circumstances being natural does not mean that they are not also divine. So then let's come to our focus for tonight, God active in the world. What we'll see is that God's presence in our world isn't just achieved in a moment, in the click of a fingers, but rather through the careful direction of a series of events that lead to his ultimate purpose. We might feel like suddenly Russia appears in Syria. They're not in Israel yet, very close. Or Israel and the Gulf states find a connection. But what we will display tonight is that these events occur over decades of careful alignment with Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy is what speaks to us about God's active role in our world. The war in Syria, Russia in the Middle East, the changing role of the USA, Brexit and the changing face of Europe. These events don't occur by accident. As they play out in direct alignment with Bible prophecy, it gives us confidence that God is powerful and active in our world today. One of the most detailed prophecies about the events of the world in the last days is Ezekiel 38. We're not going to go into detail of this prophecy tonight. I'll just give you a brief overview, but we are going to look at events in our world that play out in alignment with this prophecy. If it's not something you're familiar with, I'd encourage you to go home and study. The study classes we've had will give you all the tools you need to understand that chapter, and the others we'll consider tonight. But in a brief summary, the map you'll see on the screen describes the events of Ezekiel 38. It sets up two warring parties, one from the uttermost parts of the north and the other led by Tarshish and the young lions. And we understand that prophecy to represent Russia and modern Europe and other countries coming down into Israel in the last days, as it says in the chapter, to take its spoil, to enact the final war before Christ's return. So let's dive in. I'm sure you're all aware that there is a war in Syria right now. But to understand where we are today, we need to take a step back. Tonight we'll endeavour to put significant world events in a broader context, because we know that the news we see is not born at the moment we become aware of it. We'll see how small events over time have led to the dramatic position we see today. So to understand the context and the history that led to the war we see in Syria, let's start by looking at the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States that followed World War II. The conflict began almost immediately at the end of that war, and then began to finally de-escalate in the early 90s. Over the course of 4 decades, these two opposing sides engaged in conflict indirectly, and one example of this occurred in 1979. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to assist with defeating a dictator that they had put in place against an uprising rebel militia group. Young men from across the Middle East flocked to Afghanistan to join the rebel group in their struggle, and many see this journey as an entry into a holy or a religious struggle. And as a consequence, they developed extremist views. Among the men that were drawn to Afghanistan is a well-educated young Saudi by the name Osama bin Laden. Also in Afghanistan at the same time is a semi-illiterate former gang leader or street thug from Jordan who calls himself Abu Musab al-Zakari. These two men, although initially involved in the same struggle, do not get along and never will, and create the groups we now know today as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan towards the end of the 80s, and then it's followed by the end of the Cold War. And these two men return home to Jordan and the Gulf, respectively. Back home, bin Laden grows Al-Qaeda into the global network that we would all be familiar with, to continue the jihad struggle against Islam's enemies, and namely the United States. Zakawi tries the same, but his group remains just a small gang in Jordan. And during that time, both the men returned to Afghanistan to continue their mission, that country now being ruled by the Taliban, until an event that changed the course of our world. September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda attacks America from its base in Afghanistan, and the horror and the terror of that event has an unparalleled impact on US politics and the entire world, and as a result, the US invades Afghanistan. Bin Laden flees to Pakistan. Zakari flees to a remote and lawless corner of Iraq. And 2 years after this, the US takes another action which will transform the Middle East and set the stage for ISIS.
Coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
The Americans invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein's regime. They disband the Iraqi army, and thousands of Iraqi soldiers, angry and no longer with a purpose, join Zakari's Sunni insurgency. Jihadist groups from across the Middle East see the US invasion as a repeat of what the Soviet Union did in the 70s, and so they rush to Iraq. And we're back at another holy struggle. New insurgents swarm into Iraq, ready to fight, and various groups emerge from this melting pot. And Zarqawi takes its position as the most ruthless. He deliberately sparks a civil war and galvanises his group of jihadists, quickly becoming a jihad superstar. That leaves us at the end of 2010. War-torn Iraq is in tatters, a chaos of extremist groups, and the Muslim civil war continues. Meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East is on the precipice of major and widespread upheaval.
It was a revolution sparked by an act of desperation, born out of decades of living under an oppressive regime. Tunisia's uprising began when this man, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire after authorities confiscated his vegetable stand. His death led to mass protests and the resignation of President Zine al-Abidine bin Ali, who had ruled for more than 20 years. The winds of change spread across North Africa and the Middle East in what was to become the Arab Spring.
The actions of that Tunisian street vendor sparked a firestorm that swept through the entire Middle East, rattling it to its core in a series of revolutions that we now know as the Arab Spring. This small event triggered a revolution of oppressed peoples in Arab countries across the entire Middle East. Leaders were toppled in Tunisia, Algeria, Jordan, Oman, Egypt, Yemen, Sudan, Iraq, Libya and Lebanon. Spurred on by the power of social media and its ability to stir up protests and angst towards long-time oppressive regions. You can see the thousands of tweets flooding through as people gathered to protest against these regimes. And now we turn our attention to Syria. The Arab Spring caused an uprising of protesters against the dictator Bashar al-Assad, and he cracks down violently. Assad, fearing that the world will turn against him and side with the protesters, releases terrorists held prisoner to join the protesters, and they quickly turn into a violent extremist group. This makes it harder for foreign powers to align with these rebels. Now, Al-Qaeda, weakened by years of fighting with America, are looking to boost their image. And so they form an alliance with Zarqawi's group that we spoke about earlier, growing to form the group AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Following this, Zarqawi is killed by a drone strike in 2006, and the group struggles to gain more traction outside of its stronghold in northern Iraq. But then, in 2011, America makes the decision to leave Iraq. And as American troops fade from the Iraqi landscape, a new threat fills the void left behind. An unstable nation lacking poor leadership was the perfect breeding ground for a new kind of terror. Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI, now headed by Baghdadi, one of his key strategies is to attack prisons across Iraq and release hundreds of prisoners, thus strengthening his growing new terror group. The rebels in Syria quickly align themselves to this new force, and before long we have the spreading threat of terror across the Middle East, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS presents a major, competent and powerful terror organisation, and Syria descends into civil war. The civil war drags more and more countries into the conflict, with key players in the Middle East pulled into this complex struggle. And in addition to Saudi Arabia and Iran, more countries join this struggle, and this is where we get to the interesting bit. America joins the fight in response to the use of chemical weapons, and the rise of ISIS, the fear of that terror, brings Russia into the war. ISIS will never be the world power that they plan to be, but they are the catalyst that has brought Russia into the arena of the Middle East and into this crucible of conflict, an extremist militia. And then, with all these nations warring against each other, no one able to find their spot, a tweet from President Trump completely shifted the landscape. Trump said, "I was elected on getting out of these ridiculous, endless wars, where our great military functions as a policing operation to the benefit of people who don't even like the USA. The two most unhappy countries at this move are Russia and China, because they love seeing us bogged." As the US withdrew from yet another Middle East conflict, Putin becomes the region's new power broker, and he fills the gap left by the US. So you can see, as we track this over the course of 3 decades, the steady increase of events, the development of terror in Afghanistan that led to ISIS in Iraq and then ISIS entering Syria, pulls the Russians down into this war. And then as soon as America leaves, Russia fills the void. As one commentator put it, Russian President Vladimir Putin looks to be the kingmaker in Syria after signing a deal with Turkey that could determine the future of the region after years of civil war. You can see now on the screen the map that highlights the Russian military presence slowly descending down into the Middle East. First in Ukraine, and then in Georgia, and now in Syria, right on the doorstep of Israel. For decades, Russia has only had an indirect involvement in this region. But with this power shift comes a new era for our world. This is one of the most consequential developments we have seen in recent years. All of a sudden, Russia finds itself right at the border of Israel. And look at what the world's media has to say.
America has set its crosshairs firmly on Turkey, announcing punishing sanctions against the country and ordering an immediate ceasefire along the Syrian border. The demand came during a tense phone call between both countries' presidents.
Russia and Turkey agreed to push Kurdish forces out of northeast Syria after a US brokered ceasefire expired. But as Washington pulls back, is Russia becoming the region's new power broker? And what are the implications for the wider Middle East? This is Inside Story.
The United States is pulling out of Syria. Russian President Vladimir Putin signaled Moscow's growing influence in the Middle East.
You mentioned that power shift that you could palpably feel on the ground in Syria. Stepping back and looking at the big picture in the region, the US withdrawal shores up Iran and Russia's positions there. How could that play out more broadly for the Middle East?
Well, very definitely the vacuum that has been created has been rapidly filled by Russia in particular.
Victory in Syria is part of Russia's plan to be seen as a serious power broker all over the world. Syria is its entrance into the Middle East, but it's also a key part of Russia's rise and prominence.
And a high-powered US team is right now headed for Ankara. The Vice President, Mike Pence, Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, will personally meet with the Turkish President, Recep Erdogan, to push for that ceasefire. But of course, Erdogan has a powerful ally now, and he's been invited to Moscow in the coming days for talks with Russia's President, Vladimir Putin, whose grip on this region is suddenly a lot stronger. It's going to be a critical 48 hours.
But if you look at the New World Order, would you say overall globally, it's Russia and Vladimir Putin that is the big winner?
Yes, I think so. And I think the losers are U.S. credibility with our allies, NATO as an alliance. Think about this for a minute. Russia and Turkey, a NATO ally, are doing these joint patrols together. Putin is peeling off the second largest army, that's Turkey, in NATO. That ought to concern us from an alliance perspective, as well as the geopolitical indications you mentioned, Fred.
I also pointed out to the president I had concerns that the L road seemed to lead to Putin. The Russians have been trying to get a foothold in the Middle East for a very long time unsuccessfully, and now the president has given them an opportunity with the Kurds reaching out to them for support in Syria. They have the Russians were the beneficiaries of any withholding of assistance or encouragement to the Ukraine. Again, Putin benefits. The Russians benefited, Putin did. The president placed some doubt about our commitment to NATO right from the start of his administration. All roads lead to Putin.
The Turkish president, though, vowing to finish the job. Recep Tayyip Erdogan staring down Syria and Russia wants ultimate victory here, whatever the cost. In northern Iraq, Amelia Adams, 9 News.
Russia's grip on the region is suddenly becoming a lot stronger. Syria is its entrance to the Middle East. As the US minimised its presence, all but abandoning the Middle East, Russia has filled the void, taking a prominent position in the Middle East. We put up before Ezekiel 38, and this is exactly the position that we anticipate as Bible believers for Russia to take. ISIS drew Russia into this war, but see what the commentators have written. Russian intervention will not defeat the Islamic State, but it might save the Assad regime, while giving Moscow a new sphere of influence in the Middle East. These are truly remarkable events that have seen Russia take her position right on the borders of Israel, approaching the mountains of Israel in neighbouring Syria. It's the events of Ezekiel 38 playing out before our eyes. And so, as we continue mapping God's activity in the world, let's look at another prophecy. It was our reading tonight, Daniel chapter 11. And it's a prophecy that maps out the events from the Persian Empire in approximately 500 BC through to our era, the last days or the latter days. Throughout the scriptural record, there's a number of examples of different chapters or sections that speak about the same event. And this passage in Daniel 11 is one such example. The final verses of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, are what we would call a parallel prophecy to Ezekiel 38. And that's because they describe exactly the same events. The invasion of a northern army, or a northern confederacy, or a northern alliance into the Middle East, into the land of Israel, and those events occur in the last days. If you've got time afterwards, it's worth putting the two records side by side and mapping them next to each other, just to see the similarities and how they're spanning the same events. Let's look at this in a little more detail to understand how this prophecy sets up the events of the last days. The prophecy goes into great detail about the events at the tail end of the Greek Empire. We're not going to look at all of it in great detail tonight, but we want to focus on one element. I don't have COVID, it's okay. Daniel 11 lays out that at the close of the Greek Empire, the empire will be divided, and two of the major regions of that division are referred to as the King of the North and the King of the South, and they represent the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Empire respectively. Essentially, these two regions were taken up by generals in the Greek army that ruled the regions following the fall of that entire empire. And now here's the important concept of this prophecy. The prophecy describes the King of the North in verses 7 through 14, and it lays out its region of power as the region of the ancient Seleucid Empire. The prophecy describes the events that occur at the close of the Greek Empire in this context. But then what the prophecy does is it carries on through the timeline of historical events until we arrive at verse 40, which, as we heard in our reading, is described as at the time of the end. So we know it's referring to our time, the last days. And the real power in this prophecy is that it tells us that the King of the North, as described earlier in the prophecy, reappears in the last days. And the idea behind this is that the King of the North, that we understand to be Russia from Ezekiel 38, will again take over the region of the ancient Seleucid Empire, in effect becoming a modern version of the ancient King of the North. So you can see how the prophecy does that. It takes the King of the North and the actions described in the earlier verses, and then it pulls that same character down through the prophetic record down to the last days in verse 40, and we see a re-emergence of this king in the time of the end. So then what is the region of the ancient Seleucid Empire? I'm sure a few of you history buffs are already aware, but for the rest of us, we'll be enlightened. If we look at the map, what we'd expect to see is a drawing together of these key nations that make up this region into a northern power. The 6 prominent nations of Syria, Turkey, Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan are the modern nations that represent this ancient Seleucid Empire. Now, we've already seen the alignment of Syria and Turkey in our opening review of events that led up to the war in Syria. We've seen Russia's emergence there as the key player in both Syria and Turkey and deepening military ties with Turkey. But as we see the King of the North expanding its reach, it doesn't stop there. With the changing face of the Middle East, with the US withdrawal, it has also strengthened the Russian relationship with Iraq, a former US ally. The headline reads, "Iraq turns to Russia for military support and oil deals." And further, the next country in this region, Iran, one of the most prominent nations in the entire Middle East, is termed the new power couple of the Middle East with Russia. And the war in Syria has brought the two nations even closer together as part of their ongoing involvement with that region. And finally, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Russia has been in those regions before, but this time they're here to mirror what they've already achieved in Syria and to seize the position of power from the United States. And even more importantly is Russia's military connection with these regions. This is perhaps one of the most underreported events of 2020 as the world's distracted by COVID and the American elections and two old men fighting each other on a stage. Russia is constantly staging military exercises with these nations. Right now, today, there is a military exercise going on its southern border with Armenia, Belarus, China, Iran and Pakistan, aligning with key nations from this region. So as we step back, the events we are seeing are truly extraordinary. This is the gradual reformation of the ancient King of the North, exactly as Daniel 11 laid out. And it's not just the Russian position with these nations, it's that they are engaging in direct military activity together. The Russian military exercises that I just referred to that have been going on this week involved 80,000 troops on its southern border. That's less than 2,000 kilometres from the city of Jerusalem, less from the borders of Israel.
The massive week-long Caucasus 2020 military exercises have kicked off in southern Russia. The country's servicemen demonstrate their capabilities alongside their allies from China and a lot of other countries.
These events are astonishing for students of Bible prophecy. We are seeing right before us God active in the world with the coordination of a latter-day military force by the King of the North. Russia's creeping influence across the Middle East goes ahead unchecked as God actively directs the nations towards the final crescendo. Daniel's prophecy continues as we read tonight over in the next chapter, in verse 1. It says, "And there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time." And it would be fitting to describe 2020 as the year of unprecedented chaos. Yes, our world has seen bushfires or pandemics before, but it is the combination of global society-shifting events that has plunged our world into an unprecedented time of trouble. The Black Summer bushfires in Australia and now similar events being experienced in California were as devastating as they were unprecedented. The worst bushfire crisis this country has ever experienced. Over 5,000 buildings destroyed, half the country's population affected by smoke, over 1 billion animals and 34 people killed during this crisis. What happened in Australia during the summer we've just gone through isn't isolated. Extreme weather events, natural disasters, forest fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. are causing chaos the world over, setting fear and anxiety into the hearts of men as they see the intensity and the impact of natural events increasing. The COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure you're all aware of that, is causing fundamental changes to our world. Even today, President Trump's announced that he's come down with COVID, so we'll see how that plays out. And the flow-on economic and social impacts are having disastrous effects to our world. Even here in Australia, homelessness is increasing at an unchecked and rapid rate. Social anxiety spurred on by this crisis is pervading every corner of our world. It is inescapable. and we have no clarity on what these events hold for the future of our world. The same weather events that led to the disastrous bushfires here in Australia have created the perfect storm for the worst locust plague in decades across Africa, affecting access to the basic necessity of food for over 1 million people, and it's referred to as a plague of biblical proportions. And finally, the tension we see in our world, outworked through riots and protest and social unrest. The deep-rooted challenges of racial tension have ignited the Black Lives Matter movement in America, with some form of protest in almost every American state and across the world. Riots continue across the Middle East, into Hong Kong, Venezuela, Sudan, Belarus, Colombia, and many more nations across the world as oppressed people rise up and descend their cities into chaos. We are seeing a world that is being shaken, that is being torn apart. We live in dramatic and uncertain and complex times, a time of trouble such as never was, Daniel says. And as we look back on these events, we get the sense that our world stands on the precipice of unparalleled global change. We started tonight looking at the Cold War, and we're going to come back here now to look at the next era of these events. As we saw earlier, the Cold War was between the US and the Soviet Union, and it ended in the 90s. But one thing that came out of that war was the development of a treaty referred to as Nato. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a group of nations, mostly in Europe, along with the US, that allied together after the Cold War, and their number one goal is to keep Russian military ambition under control. And essentially it was tasked with preventing war in Europe. Now, NATO has been around for decades and all was going well with the alliance. Obviously there's no war in Europe. Russia has been kept in a form of uncheckeredness, although that's not a word, but you know what I mean. All was going well with NATO until this happened. Another dramatic event in our world, November 2016, a decidedly unpredictable result. A populist surge propelled Trump forward, and there was a new president in America, the election of Donald Trump. Trump was elected as a result of the populist surge across the country, which is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people. And this is closely linked to nationalism, and this is where the challenge arose for NATO, because the idea of nationalism is focusing on the interests of one's own nation to the exclusion and detriment of the interests of any other nation. And this is exactly what we have seen.
With the election of Donald Trump, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization now faces one of the biggest challenges since the Cold War.
Let me ask you about U.S. participation in NATO. Do you think the United States needs to rethink U.S. involvement in NATO?
Yes, because it's costing us too much money. And frankly, they have to put up more money. They're going to have to put some up also. We're paying disproportionately. It's too much. And frankly, it's a different world than it was when we originally conceived of the idea and everybody got together.
This tweet from Trump describes his position on NATO. We have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and the military. Very bad for the US. This will change. Another tweet from Trump. What good is NATO if Germany is paying Russia billions of dollars for gas and energy? Why are there only 5 out of 29 countries that have met their commitment? The US is paying for Europe's protection, then loses billions on trade. Must pay. I thought he might have made a spelling mistake. Must pay 2% of GDP immediately. Trump's repeated attacks on NATO have opened the way for increased Russian power in not only Europe, but the Middle East. We've already seen the effects of this in Syria, and we saw it in the news reports on the Russian position in Syria. As America pulls back from the world stage, we see Russia filling the gap. Now, Trump is up for re-election in just over a month, and who can predict what will happen in America? But he has already left his mark on that country and its politics because his nationalist strategy is playing out positively in the American electorate, and it will be difficult to wind back from that position. At the same time as America is pulling back from global conflicts, the stage is set for the final events of Ezekiel 38. Britain's departure from the European Union, referred to as Brexit, we saw it in the opener, places the nation in the position that Bible believers anticipate before the return of Jesus Christ. Another example, you may have heard that in just the last month, Israel has signed historic agreements with nations of the Gulf state, aligning with the ancient region of Dedan and paving the way for Sheba or Saudi Arabia to follow, just as Ezekiel 38 lays out. Meanwhile, Putin continues to exert Russian influence in Africa, continuing military and strategic ties with countries across that region, further aligning ties to the pattern of prophecy as we expect Russia to align with Libya and Ethiopia. And then the photo you see on the screen, one of the most significant photos of the last 12 months. We have Putin, who is Rosh or Russia. We have Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, a representation of Magog. We have Erdogan, the President of Turkey, representing Tagama in Ezekiel 38. And we have Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, representing Goma. This is an unparalleled demonstration of the alignment of key European nations to the Ezekiel 38 prophecy. We are truly living in remarkable times. Everyone is playing their part, preparing for the time of the end. The major players have already taken their positions on the stage, and they are simply reading their lines from the script of Bible prophecy. You think God isn't active in our world? Look around you, see what's happening in our world. God is preparing the nations. Look at this summary from John Thomas. When Russia makes its grand move for building up its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact. The last decade has seen absolutely incredible events in the Middle East as Russia expands its influence. The star of Moscow is shining brightly in the Middle East, as this article puts it. Look at what we've seen as we've considered the flow of modern history tonight. We've seen the US drawing back with an isolationist, nationalist agenda disappearing from the pages of history just as it is disappeared from the pages of Bible prophecy. The UK is distancing themselves from Europe with enacting the Brexit policy, pulling away from what we think will be a European alliance that joins with Rosh in the last days. Israel is aligning herself with Sheba and Dedan, the Gulf states, and Russia is extending their reach, becoming the key player in the Middle East, across Europe and into Northern Africa. We are standing on the precipice, and all it will take now is for Russia to flick the switch and the entire course of history will change. Just think about the fact that they have close to 100,000 troops within driving distance of Israel. You could drive from here to Brisbane and you would have gone a further distance than those troops are right now. Albeit you would have had to drive through a civil war, so it might have been slightly more challenging. Although, depending on your view on New South Wales, maybe not so much. We should be asking ourselves, what is coming next? How will an apparently small event trigger another period of change? We've seen tonight the flow of events directed by God, active in the world. We can sometimes look at what we've seen, the Arab Spring, Brexit, Trump, Putin, as isolated events, but the world doesn't work that way. They're all connected. They're all affecting each other. Soon it won't just be the headlines and the news that we've seen tonight. The days are coming where there'll be a headline that will change our world forever. Look at the headlines we're seeing right now. Listen to the news. Look around you. Watch. See the current events. God is active in the world. There's all this noise, all this commotion. God is shaking the nations. The sea and the waves are roaring. He's getting ready. And coming soon, one day, we'll read this headline instead. Russian troops encircle Israel's capital as Prime Minister Netanyahu declares the brink of world war. And when we see that, we'll finally know he's here at last. We have no need to fear or panic, young people, as the world around us descends into chaos. Because the same God that is so obviously active in our world today is active in your life as well. In a world that is spinning out of control, that's more crazy and chaotic than ever before, it can sometimes be easy to lose sight of the simple truth that God is there. He will not be moved, and he is utterly dependable. The time of trouble that Daniel describes is followed with a message of encouragement. In Daniel 12 it says, "But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name is found written in the book." As we come to reflect across this weekend, reflect on God's presence in our life, the power of the present, let us stop and pause and consider these timeless words from the Psalms. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. That's God active in the world. I will be exalted in the earth. God active in the world. God is active in our world, young people, and that gives us immense confidence. But the message from tonight is that more than anything, God is there. Through all the distress, the complexities of life, the stress we face, the challenges we have, the fear, the anguish that we may face, God is there and he will not be moved. And we live our lives in the power of his presence. We'll close with this quote from Robert Roberts. "A little more waiting for God, a little more patience, a little more endurance of evil, and continuance in well-doing. And the hour will arrive. The moment will be here when we shall be suddenly confronted by the great fact that the Lord is in the earth. Great will be the joy of the saints at the announcement, though they mingle their trembling with fear." God is active in our worlds. He is active in your lives. That is the power of the present.